To get started with the first session, I personally did not introduce myself. This is not of any importance. My name is Father Gabriele Gozzi, Deputy Director of the Institute for Religious Sciences, teacher of the Church and Patrology, and I was given the role of moderating this first session of the Philo meeting. Now, we inaugurate the first session, and we should look at it as something that fully falls into the framework of the spirit that was characterizing the 2017 and 2018 editions. In other words, it was not just simply presenting just a work amongst the many Philonian works, just highlighting the themes and the literary styles, but rather starting from a text, a text of Philo. The aim is the one of dig into the effort that was made by Philo in order to achieve a mediation and a dialogue that could bring together the different cultures of his own times. So this is an example of integration, bringing together a number of cultures, an example which is extraordinarily topical, even after some 21 centuries. The treatise on the biblical figure of Joseph that we are this year analyzing and studying opens the pathway and leads towards a number of different themes, one of which is politics. The policies are seen as an ideal theme of governance, the relationship between the subjects and sovereigns. Today we would say between citizens and institutions. The Josepho then also allows us to extend our interest on the mystics and modernity, as was briefly said before and hinted to the interpretation of dreams, which is also opening another chapter that is the one of psychoanalysis, without forgetting the role played by the character and figure of Joseph also within the Islamic tradition. All of these aspects are going to be touched upon and deepened during the sessions that will be taking place in the next days. Today, we are going to look at the text that is the work of Philo, trying to establish what was the historical cultural context within which the figure of Joseph is looked at. And even this aspect seems to be very necessary, because although he was an eminent member of the Alexandrian community, Philo was someone who was very much private, and out of his own texts and works, nothing emanates about his own person. He never says anything or almost anything about himself. We know that he participated to the ambassadorship with Caligula to try and stop the persecutions of the Jews of that time. But we know that he lives in between Alexandria and Rome, at the crossroads between these two cities, Alexandria and Rome. That is to say, at the crossroads of two distinct worlds and very distant cultures. And by so doing, he is looking for a communication. Now, the influence of the historical cultural context is going to be dealt with by the first speaker, Ludovica de Luca. She is a scholar with the University of L'Aquila, and she has been working there until the 2022, and she was dealing with this figure. And she was also concentrating her work on the work of Philo, the Opificio Mundi. And we know that this work has so many aspects in common with the Josepho. The Professor De Luca was also making an introduction in the book edited by Guaraldi, which is once again reproposing the introduction of the Josepho by Clara Claus Reggiani, that was published exactly on the occasion of this meeting. So she will be helping us to establishing the framework of the De Josepho in the framework of the Judaic Hellenistic thought. Now, prior to passing to her the floor, I would like to recall that each speaker has a maximum of 25 minutes to make his own contribution. And after that, we would like to have some 10-15 minutes devoted to possible questions or possible side notes or comments. I would like to also say to all of those who have logged in and who are connected that in order to ask questions, you have to click on the hand that you see on the bottom bar and which you see on your screen. So there is a hand there raised, and then the control room is the one that is going to coordinate the session directly from the Gregorian University in Rome, and the control room technician and the staff will be passing the floor to each one of us. Now, the floor goes to Ludovica De Luca, Professor Ludovica De Luca. I do apologize if my own introduction was not really explaining how expert she is and praising her expertise. But once again, I would like to thank her for her participation and for the immense gift of her own contribution. And let me also say how honored we are to be having her as a speaker with us.
Many thanks, first of all. So I'll be reading my presentation. I am immensely grateful to the organizers for having invited me to take part in this wonderful conference on Philo, a multifaceted thinker who lived in Alexandria and Rome from 20 BC to 49 AD. During my research doctorate, I also dealt with another work of Philo, De Opificio Mundi. I'd like to thank the organizers because preparing this paper allowed me to gain a greater understanding of De Josepho and therefore to extend the coverage of my studies. Even though these are works which have different features, De Opificio and De Josepho have a number of common aspects. First of all, that they belong to the same group of works which are known in our times as exposition of the Mosaic Law. These works were probably composed in the last part of Philo's life, after his mission to Rome. As he tells us in his Legatio ad Gaium, Philo left Alexandria to go to Rome, where he was perhaps the head of the mission of the Jewish community to ask the Emperor Caligula to provide greater guarantees for the Jews of Alexandria. And Prefect Flaccus, governor of Egypt from 32 to 38 AD, the life of the Jewish community had become unbearable, and Alexandria, the Jews were subject to ongoing harassment, such as the profanation of their synagogues. Even though the mission was a failure and the problems of the community of Alexandria continued, Philo had to spend a number of years in Rome, and the most recent hypotheses suggest that the new cultural and philosophical climate, where there was a major Stoic component, had an effect on his thought and works. The period Philo spent in Rome must have influenced him so much that the works written after 38 AD seem to be addressed to a different readership than the works which he composed in Alexandria in the previous years. If works as the ones which belong to the allegorical commentary of the Genesis or Questiones on Genesis and the Exodus were probably addressed to a Jewish public, the later works seem to be addressed to a Greco-Roman public, which do not seem to have had a great familiarity with the Judaic tradition. Among the common traits of the works composed after his Roman style, we find great references to certain philosophical references which can be linked to the Stoic tradition, and also the replacement of an allegorical interpretation typical of the commentary with a more literal form of writing, even though it was bolstered by a number of philosophical images. Some of these images, such as, for example, those of the world city and the banquet, are common to De Opificio and De Josepho and demonstrate the presence of a certain expressive continuity between two works. Of the exposition today, we consider making it up, De Opificio Mundi, where Philo presents his cosmology, three texts on the main protagonists of the Judaic tradition, respectively De Abrahamo, De Josepho, and De Vita Moses, and two works on the laws, the De Decalogo and De Specialibus Legibus, and two works of a more ethical nature, De Virtutibus and De Premis et Penis, which on rewards and punishments. In the works of the exposition, Philo wishes to present the pillars of the Jewish tradition: cosmology, patriarchs, and the law. He seems to be addressing a Greco-Roman public, probably not Jewish believers. With regard to the biographical works on Abraham, Joseph, and Moses, Minihoff has stressed that Philo set up a kind of national gallery which non-Jewish readers were invited to visit to contemplate the portraits of the patriarchs. Abraham, Joseph, and Moses are presented suggestively to the reader to keep up the attention of a public for whom the patriarchs were unknown or not very well known, but whom the current value of who could be recognized. The subject of De Josepho is the story of Joseph, presented as narrated at the end of Genesis. The figure of Joseph in general appears central to the Corpus Philonicum and is dear to Philo from his allegorical commentary. In Josepho, Philo, even with some gaps, follows the order of the verses in Genesis from 37:2 to 50:22. However, in this kind, he does not give a lemmatic interpretation, but presents him inside a new literary frame which had not been used before, the works of the exhibition. That is to say, the genre of biography, which had a lot of success in later authors like Plutarch. In De Josepho, Philo therefore steps away from the allegorical lemma-based commentary, typical of the commentary, to approach the new genre of biography, which is not developed only on a historical narrative level, but where a lot of scope is left to philosophical speculation. The figure of Joseph is presented on the cusp of a realism, which sees him handling his situation as a slave who depends on his master, subject to the will of the mass, and also idealism, the idealism of a aner politikos, a political man. The action of the statement, according to Philo, is guided by God, and all his actions represent a form of interpretation of divine will. Joseph noted to have interpreted the dreams of the head cupbearer, the head baker, and the pharaoh. In Philo's view, represents the ideal statesman who mediates between God and his people. The many-colored coat which his father Jacob gives him becomes the symbol of the multiple aspects of the statement, polarized between the need to accept compromises and to represent a model of earthly power. The Philo's representation of Joseph as a aner politikos seems to eradicate the political role carried out by Philo in the mission to Caligula, where he affirms his ambition to mediate between the cruelty of the emperor and the will to see the rights of the Alexandrian community respected, but perhaps also as a consequence of the political situation which Philo is experiencing. In those years, Joseph is a political
Potresti
figure
citare un modello
who
morale o
finds
affare
himself
riferito a questi
caught between
cittadini?
the search for honor and
L'antica
glory
Alessandria
and
non corrisponde a una
the need
grande
to represent a
metropolitana,
moral model
essendo
which can be an
difficile
example
definire lingue e
for
culture diverse,
earthly
quindi trovare
statesmen.
modelli civili
Ancient
e convivenza
Alexandria
comune.
resembles a great
Anche
modern
se tale
metropolis,
convivenza non ha sempre prodotto
being the
riscontri
crossroads
civili,
of many
Philo non
different languages and
fraintende e sembra
religions.
cercare Roma come
Philo
nuovo punto di integrazione,
sees Rome
in
as a
cui
new
culture
model of
diverse possano
integration where
cooperare insieme
different
per
cultures can
costituire un
cooperate
ideale
together
civile
to
comune come punto di
establish a
riferimento
common
per tutte le
civil
società.
model as a
Philo
reference
ne
point
finge
for
con la sua presentazione di
heterogeneity.
Giuseppe come uomo
Philo,
politico,
therefore, with
attualizza
his
una postura
presentation of
giuridica,
Joseph as a statement,
presentandolo in modo tale che i
um,
cittadini dell'impero,
updates a
beneficiari
biblical
destinatari
figure,
dell'opera,
presenting
potevano
him so that
facilmente
the
intuire la
citizens of the
figura di
empire,
Giuseppe in
potential
relazione agli singoli
addressees of the work,
cittadini.
could
La strategia di
easily
Filone sembra essere
place
rivolta a instaurare una nuova
Joseph in a
concezione di
relationship with
Giuseppe,
the
in
political
termini di
examples of the
disagio e
time.
capacità di
Philo's
governarsene,
strategy
che
seems to
potevano essere
be
così
addressed
rimandate
to
nel mondo in direzioni più
um,
impellenti.
asking for new
Trovare un
attention
linguaggio
towards
comune è una
Joseph,
motivazione
stressing
culturale
his
religiosa.
mediating abilities, which could be
Nell'attualità, e
implemented in a
Giuseppe è
world
un
in
esempio
which
filoviano, noi
it
visiede solo
was
una figura finita e
important to find a
perfetta
common
come
language for culture
espressione
and
della
religious
situazione
living
politica
together.
del suo tempo,
The
perché gli appare
contemporary value of
anche come
Joseph in
politico
De
ideale
Josepho
che tutti
does
noi,
not only
cittadini della
reside in
pandemia da
being
Covid-19,
interpreted as an
dovremmo
expression of the
vedere in
political
azione.
situation of the time,
Trovare
because
gravissima
he also
questo
appears as
Giuseppe
the ideal
assente.
statesman which we
Filone
all
descrive l'uomo politico come
would
un
like to see in
medico che
action
deve
as
curare
we
lo stato malato
experience the
e le
COVID
immagini
19
dal mondo della
pandemic. In
medicina rimangono
Josepho's
ossessione
75
mentre
77,
istruzioni
Philo
e
describes the
prescritti
statement as a
che
doctor
il politico
who has to
Giuseppe
cure
assume per il
the
bene del
diseased
pubblico
state, and
ha il
the
compito di gestire
images
e
of the world
governare.
in medicine have
Il riferimento principale di
wide
Filone e il
distribution in
ricorso
the description
all'analogia
of
politico-medico
the
oltre al doctor,
famine which
sembra
the
essere il
statements
politico di
Joseph
Platone,
has
dove lo
to
straniero,
manage and
parlando per via di
treat.
Socrate, afferma che il
The
politico deve
main
agire come un
reference of
medico, il
Philo
quale
is
cura sempre
seems
ogni
to be
costo,
the
sia che ne
statesman
abbia il
of
consenso o
Plato,
meno,
where the
sia che
foreigner
egli sia
speaking of
ricco
the
o
young
povero.
Socrates states that the
Il
politician
medico
must
deve pensare
act
solo a
as a
se
physician,
stesso.
treating a
Nei
patient at
paragrafi
all
33
costs. In paragraphs
34 la
33,
presenza del
34,
politico
the
platonico
presence
continua a farsi sentire.
of
Come invece
Plato's
Filone
statesman
riprende la medesima
continues to be
associazione tra le
felt.
figure del
Philo
timoniere e del
takes up the
medico,
same
che oltre
association
che nella
between
tradizione
the figure of the
cinico-storica
helmsman and the
troviamo già in
physician,
Platone.
which we already find
L'uomo
in
politico
Plato.
infatti per Filone
The
da una
statesman
parte
for
opera come
Philo,
il timoniere di una
on the one
nave
hand,
che può
works as
mutare
the
lentamente
helmsman of a
decidendo delle
ship,
manovre che farà
which,
e
in changing
decidendo poi di mettere le
circumstances,
sue mani
decides
solo in un unico
which
metodo,
maneuvers are
e
to be
dall'altra
made,
come il
and
medico che
does
non
not
cura
limit himself to
continuamente lo
one
stesso
method in steering
metodo,
the boat,
ma
and on
che
the
a
other hand,
seconda dei
as a
casi sceglie il metodo
physician who,
migliore.
depending on the
Secondo
circumstances,
Filone, allo
chooses
stesso
the
modo in
best
cui
treatment.
agiscono il timoniere e il
According to
medico,
Philo, in
devono essere intesi molteplici volti per
the
l'uomo
same way in
politico,
which
che
helmsmen and
mutano
doctors'
a
work also
seconda
have
che
to
ci si
be
trovi
applied
in tempi di
for
pace o
statesmen.
di guerra,
And
o che si
this
debbano
method changes
fronteggiare
depending on
prove o
whether
molte
we're in
opposizioni.
times of war or peace, or whether
Nonostante sia
few or
prolifica la
many
produzione
opponents
di
exist.
immagini
Even
nella
though
propria
there is
opera,
considerable
il Di
production of
Giuseppe però
images in
non
the
è
work,
un'opera
De
allegorica come
Josepho is
invece
not
possiamo trovare nei
allegorical,
commentari.
unlike
La figura di
the
Giuseppe
books
è
in the
presentata
commentary.
da
The
Filone
figure of
come una ripresa
Joseph
letterale della
is
scrittura,
presented by
invariata dalle sue
Philo
riflessioni
as a
politiche che vengono
literal
sviluppate verso stile espressivo e ricco di
extract
immagini
from the
filosofiche.
scriptures,
La stessa è
integrated with
Austrigiani
ethical
che
political
parla a mio avviso
considerations.
erroneamente di digressioni e
Kosrejani, who in
interpretazioni
my opinion
allegoriche
refers to
nel De Josepho,
digressions and allegorical
denuncia di
interpretations in De
conluce e
Josepho,
influenze che afferma
himself
che si
highlights
metta
the
per esempio la figura
incongruities which
simbolica di
surface if
Giuseppe
we
nel De Josepho con la
relate the
rappresentazione
symbolical
dell'emergere del
figure of
commentario, che nel
Joseph in the
personaggio che
Josepho
osserva
with the
l'impetuosa
representation
nave
which
parte può
emerges
restare
from the
traccia della
commentary, where
memoria.
the person
Nel
and the
commentario, la tragedia di
narrative
Giuseppe sembra farne
events
spunto per dare avvio
set
all'interpretazione
aside to
allegorica.
leave space to the
Chiamata
allegory.
Marenius,
As
a cambiare tra le
Meinhof
opere della
said,
esposizione e quelle
what
del
changes
commentario,
in
poi, è
from the
fatto oltre che
exposition to
paradigma
the commentary
filosofico.
is the
Filone non è più interessato alla
philosophical paradigm.
dicotomia
Philo is no longer
corpo, corpo
interested
e
in
anima,
the
e differenza
dichotomy
dello
of
stoicismo
a
più
Platonic nature
consistente
between soul
anche in
and body,
relazione
and the
alle
influence of
caratteristiche formali
Stoicism becomes more
dell'esposizione,
consistent
che
also in
potevano
relation
ben
to the
riconoscere un linguaggio assai familiare nel
Greco-Roman
materiale come
public of
Cristoforo.
the exposition. even though it's not correct, as Carl Klaus Reggiani does, to speak of allegory in relation to a work which, even though with considerable rhetorical figures, can be connected to a symbolic allegorical interpretation typical of the commentary on which is used to introduce philosophical digressions on the part of Philo. In paragraph 28, the interpretation of the figure of Joseph as a statesman begins by stating that it is worthwhile, after a literal exposition, to add an explanation of the deeper meanings of the fact that in Upanais, because all or the majority of the facts of the law are expressed in allegorical form. The use of this allegorical symbolic lexicon is restricted to very few paragraphs. This exceptional use of a different stylistic key may have a propadeutical role and be used by Philo to introduce its interlocutors to the fact that the literal exposition of the biblical facts would be followed by a philosophical interpretation similar to the allegoresis which Stoics developed from the Homeric myths. This rare change of stylistic register might be one of the attempts Philo makes in De Josepho to present the scripture from a Stoic key. The need to present these methodological premises should be contextualized in a reflection of a philosophical, ethical, political mode, which, according to the typical literary style of Philo, is made effective and more comprehensible to his public thanks to the use of metaphorical images like the one of the statesman or the statesman as physician. If we now look at what makes this and other works by Philo part of the so-called Judaic-Hellenistic thought, I would go back to the definition of the expression mentioned by F. Calabi. Judaic-Hellenistic thought is a very broad expression which has no clear boundaries. It involves philosophy, but this is not does not limit it. It extends to paranetic, it leads to other areas such as religious writing, apologetic or paranetic development. So with great variety. This is how Francesca Calabi's history of Judaic-Hellenistic thought begins, where a number of canons are established to guide oneself in a flexible boundaries, which covers works belonging to different genres and not cannot be traced back to a single theme, a single geographical place, or a single language, even though generally these are works written in Greece and which can be contextualized in the entourage of the Hellenistic and imperial city of Alexandria. Inside this movement of thought, born in the meeting of different cultures, we have a broad production of Philo, 36 works handed down to us. Philo, perhaps preceded by Aristobulus, of whom only a few fragments remain, is one of the first authors of Jewish faith to write in Greek. Even if the works of Philo belong to different literary genres, one constant in his universe is the resort to a key of philosophical reading. Philo's works represent an original synthesis, which is characterized by an encounter and a clash between Judaism and the dominating Greco-Roman culture. In De Josepho, there are a number of signals which show the synthetic process between these two cultures in action. Most evident sign is the resort to the Greek genre of biography, which, starting from the peripatetic thought, is widespread in the Hellenistic and imperial age, and which Philo probably may have consulted in writing his Bios politico aneresti peri Iosir. Philo takes up the format which, despite distinctions, is typically Greek and which furthermore seems to be consolidated around the Library of Alexandria. Typically Hellenistic are some of the metaphorical and philosophical tropes of Philo. In paragraphs 119, 120, Joseph is described as a king, even though in the verses of Genesis 41, 37 to 46, to which these paragraphs refer, Joseph is never called a basileus. In the Septuagint, which Philo probably refers to, despite the role of prestige conferred on Joseph, Basileus is only the connotation of the pharaoh. Later, in paragraphs 140 150, there prevails a key of metaphorical interpretation of the biblical figure of Joseph. This time, it's not Joseph who's Basileus, appointed by the pharaoh, the uparchos, or the deputy of the king. The basileus is the king with which Joseph establishes an alliance. As Klaus Reggiani states in The Figure of the King in De Josepho, there's no religious connotation or priestly connotation, which, however, seems implicit in other works such as De Opificio. As Philo shows in the opening of the work in paragraph 2, Joseph from young studied the principles of shepherding or the political art, and who knows shepherding knows that it's the king who governs the flock. God himself is a shepherd, of course, guiding the entire cosmos according to laws and justice. Therefore, it's difficult to separate the characters which allow us to bring Joseph close to God. The politician Joseph is considered a king because of the paradigmatic function he plays, setting himself as an example to follow for the people. This is also a common aspect, despite the differences with some treatises on kingship attributed to pseudo-Pythagoreans of the Hellenistic age, as F. Calabi indicates in the letter of Aristea to Philocrates, an anonymous text of uncertain dating, probably composed in Hellenistic age in Alexandria. There are a number of elements which can be traced back to the Peri Basileis treatises. In the letter, the origin of the translation of the scriptures from Hebrew to Greek by the 72 wise men, which followed the will of King Ptolemy Philadelphus, or more probably his predecessor Ptolemy Soter, who wanted to collect in the library all the books ever written till then, and therefore also the Torah. According to the letter, the inspired character of the translation was guaranteed by the fact that it was carried out by wise men from Jerusalem, 6 for each of the 12 tribes. And on the first day, the king asked the first of the wise men, who was closest to him, how his kingdom could be maintained safe till the end, and he was answered that if he imitated the clemency of God, this would work. The rest of the banquet, where the king continued to ask questions, made it clear that the king, in order to be a good king, has to have followed the the Judaic model. Good governance, which can derive from following the divine model, has a ethical basis which cannot be solely based on political considerations. The answers of the wise men aim at establishing a prototype of wise king who has God as his model, and to act must himself become a model for his subjects. The idea of the king as a maximum expression of wisdom and virtue is cynical and stoic in its origin, and Philo takes from Stoicism consideration of Joseph as a virtuous, free, and wise king. In the Ethics of Chrysippus is stated, according to the Stoics, the wise man is beautiful, rich, free, and only he is king. Stobaeus also says that for Stoics, only the wise man is king. And the wise man, unlike the fool, acts because he is impelled by virtue, and in this way he exhorts others to be virtuous. For the Stoics, the wise man, like Philo's Joseph, has experience in divine matters. As Diogenes Laertius says, the wise men are divine and have God in them. Joseph is a prophet because he has science which allows him to decipher symbols which concern human life, and he has various aspects of manticism based on the interpretation of dreams, the flight of birds, and sacrifices. The Stoic wise man, as Joseph, as presented by Philo, exercises the art of politics and establishes laws. What has to be done, it does, and prohibits what should not be done. And only the wise man is nomimos, compliant with the law, because he puts it into practice, and um, exegetikos, capable of interpreting. And the political functions of the wise man are made possible by his virtue, which, as for Joseph, consist in temperance and right and measuredness. The Stoic wise man thus holds power, does not exercise it completely, being docile and being willing to follow who commands. Similar attribution of regal aspects to the figure of the statement can be found in Plato's statement, because both are linked to command and providing knowledge. Gnosis, the political man, who is a kingly man, must unify the opposites according to a correct measure. Statesmen should not solely be temperate or bold, because these can degenerate into excessiveness, but you must mix temperance and value, finding a right mediation between opposites. Even if Plato's statesman is not explicitly a sophos, as the Stoic politician, is recognized as an essential requisite to have that mediateness which characterizes Philo's Joseph. A major presence of Stoicism is found in the image of the world as a great city. Philo examines the etymology of the name of Joseph, referring again to a common practice among Stoics. He indicates in Curia prosthesis, addition to a lord, the meaning of Joseph's name, because this name shows that political activity, as expressed among individual people, is an addition, prosthesis, to the physis, understood as kata demos, politia. So, a constitution according to peoples. This world of ours is, in her opinion, logos infusius, which prescribes what is to be done and, prohibits what should not be done. The figure of Joseph invites us to go beyond the specificity of the laws of individual states, since, as we are told slightly later, paragraph 31, particular constitution should be considered as an addition to the sole constitution according to nature, so because the cities are in addition to the physios orthos logos, to the right reason of nature. The statesman is an addition to the man who lives kata physin. If on the one hand we can see re-evoke the Platonic tradition in the implementation of the particularism of laws and expression of individual communities, on the other hand, we also have to see the presence of the Stoic tradition in universal cosmopolitanism. In De Josepho and in other works, Philo takes up literary and philosophical topoi, which appear well consolidated in the Platonic and Stoic tradition, but readapts them to the Judaic cause. This is something which is typical as a way of proceeding to the Judaic Hellenistic thought, where Judaic tradition and Greco-Roman tradition meet. The specificity of Philo, close to Judaic Hellenistic thought for the ideals of universalism and for methodology used, is to make possible this encounter between different cultures. Philo, like other Jewish authors before him who were thinking Greek and as Greeks, originates a cultural synchronism which appears the full expression of his time, the melting pot of cultures and distinct cultures. We don't know whether the interpretation of Philo may have influenced the Judaic Hellenistic works which follow him. The figure of Joseph returns in other Judaic Hellenistic works, from the fourth book of the Maccabees to Joseph and Asenath. Unlike the latter, where, as in De Josepho, Joseph is presented as a virtuous model, Philo adopts a reading of the patriarch, which is primarily philosophical, and the figure of Joseph becomes an opportunity to propose his own philosophical vision of the world based on Plato's statesman and the Stoic tradition. Joseph, the ideal statements become an alternative to the power of Rome. And as May Niehoff has pointed out, the regal metaphors in Philo's final writing, composed after the mission to Rome, may refer to the fact that he saw in Judaism an alternative to Roman hierarchies. According to Niehoff, the use of regal metaphors, contemporary regal metaphors, which were expressed in the heart of the empire to show that the King of Kings was the paradigm of alternative power to that of the Roman emperor. With this model, Philo seems to suggest that the ideals of a universalism where everything is subject to the law of God, which is the law of nature, and which finds its maximum expression in the execution of the mediateness which should characterize a virtuous politician. To express this vision, Philo decides to resort to a Platonic and Stoic philosophical tradition, resorting to images and philosophical concepts which already been exhaustively affirmed and recognized in his time, almost to make universal his message, and perhaps with the aim of making himself more understandable to a Greco-Roman public. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor De Luca. Unfortunately, my moderating function makes me sort of an unpleasant coordinator, because I am always inviting you to please stay to your time, within your time limits. We are already a little bit late, and I did not intervene on purpose, because the presentation and the thoughts were truly rich in so many interesting inputs, and they were very incredibly capable of introducing the framework in which the works of Philo were born. Now, I can only allow
una
for
domanda.
one
Io penso
question,
che
if there is
questo
one question.
intervento ne abbia
And
generate
I
molte di
think that
considerazioni, di
this
richieste di
contribution was
domande.
really a highly
Lasciamo spazio solo
stimulating
a
one.
tutti,
And
quindi
unfortunately, we have to leave
chi
room
per
only
primo si
to
prenota poi ha questa
one
possibilità.
question. And the
Per
first
poi
one that
passare
has
alla
asked for the
seconda
floor
domanda.
will have the floor. After that, we will have the second contribution of this session. I think Maren Miof was asking for the floor, but she has to unmute her mic first.
Hello. Ah, sì? Ok. Non ora niente, non guardo niente. Allora, Ludovica, molto
I
grazie
think
per
that
il
I should
bellissimo
thank you very much,
intervento.
Ludovica, for this
Amo
wonderful
bene
contribution.
la tua
I
combinazione
did like very
dell'analisi
much the
filosofico e
combination of the philosophical
analisi letteraria.
analysis mixed with the
Hai
literary
parlato
analysis. I
di
did
una
really
certa
appreciate it.
continuità
Now, you
espressiva
mentioned a
tra
certain
De
expressive
Opificio e
continuity in
De
between the
Josepho.
opificio and the Josepho.
Mi
And
domando anche
I
se
am
forse
now
De Opificio
wondering
può
whether the de opificio
aiutarci
could help us
capire più
understand
il pensiero di Filone
the thought of
nel De
Philo
Josepho
in the
sul
Josepho
logos physeos.
and also its logos physios.
Grazie innanzitutto
In the
di
first
questa
place, let me
domanda
thank you for
e
this
sì,
question.
proprio
Well,
perché
yes, I
appunto ritorna un
thoroughly think
linguaggio,
that
ritornano dei temi che sono in
yes,
comune per
because
entrambe
this
le
is a
opere,
language and the
anche nel,
themes as well
nel
are
De
very much
Opificio
in common
appunto
between the two
ritroviamo
works. In the De Opificio,
l'orthos,
we once again
logos
find the
e
orthos and the
ritroviamo poi
logos,
appunto anche
and we then also
anche appunto un lessico
see a
specifico
very specific lexicon,
di origine
a very
stoica.
specific
Quindi senza
Stoic
dubbio. E penso
language.
anche che
That's
in
true,
generale
undoubtedly true. And I also
possa essere
think that in
utile
general,
studiare
it could prove very useful to
insieme
study
tutte le opere che fanno
all
parte
of the
del
works
gruppo sull'esposizione
that
della
are
legge
part
mosaica,
of the exposition of
perché
the Mosaic Law.
appunto mi sembra proprio che
And
abbiano
I think
molteplici punti di
that they
contatto.
come with multiple contact points.
Bene, grazie.
Very well.
Grazie
Thanks
anche
again.
di quest'ulteriore
Thanks also for this
precisazione,
further
risposta al quesito che è
answer
stato
to the question
posto.
that was asked.